So today, New Testament.
Yep. New Testament, but again, with Old Testament connections, this is kind of what we've been doing. So we might as well just jump right into it. We're going to do Jesus as the Gardener, which is an odd title, but some listeners may catch the reference right away. The launching pad here is John 20, verses 11 through 16. And we're going to start there and then circle back to it at the end, because believe it or not, this actually has a lot of context to it. Things that we wouldn't necessarily be inclined to think of, although people who have read Unseen Realm will probably discern real early on, and I'm going to try to, again, telegraph the connection for those people, again, who've read Unseen Realm, where this is going to go. But it's really interesting because it's just one of those things that even though you know both sides of the equation, you don't necessarily make the connections. But in this case, again, I think they're going to be apparent. But again, on the surface, you just wouldn't think of where we're going to go. Again, unless perhaps that you've read Unseen Realm. So here's John 20. I'm going to go back to verse 11 here and start there. The pivot verse is going to be verse 15. But in John 20, verse 11, this is when Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection, okay? We read, "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. And they said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' And she said to them, 'They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' And having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus." Here's verse 15. "Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?' Supposing him to be the gardener, she, Mary, said to him, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away.'" And then verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Mary," and then she recognizes, who this is. Obviously Mary doesn't expect to see a whole man, much less, Jesus. I mean, there have been people, apologetics folks, have talked about this, almost ad nauseum. How could she not recognize him? And again, we weren't there to set up the scene. We don't know if there's distance in between the two. We don't know if, he's wearing a hood or something. We don't know any of that. So it's useless to speculate it. But my point here is that really isn't the point of the passage. See, we tend to look at this and we go into modern exegesis mode. We got to solve this problem. We got to, there's this, we have to milk this passage and mine it for, apologetics value about the resurrection. And again, this is an apparent contradiction. So we need to defend this or that, that has nothing to do with what John is doing. But since we're fixated on those sorts of questions, even for those who've read Unseen Realm, it's very easy to sort of not stop and ask yourself certain questions. And then when you do, to move beyond those questions and start connecting dots. So, those of you who have read the book know all about the cosmic mountain idea and the cosmic garden idea. From the Old Testament, it goes through the Old Testament, it leaks into places in the New Testament. And this is one of those places. That wouldn't necessarily be intuitive because, again, when we come to the passage, we go into problem-solving mode or apologetics mode or something like that. In terms of the cosmic mountain, cosmic garden motif, God or the gods in other ancient Near Eastern religions, they dwelt in or on, in gardens and on mountains. And the dwelling place of the gods, the abode of the gods was, utilized that imagery, utilized those metaphors to convey certain ideas about the divine abode. Okay, its remoteness, its perfection, its paradise nature, all these sorts of things, how removed it is from human presence, and we get that. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you get that. But the same thing is true, not just of deities, but also kings. Okay, and again, in Unseen Realm, we talk about cosmic garden, cosmic mountain. There's a particular chapter where we make some connections, between kingship and David and these themes and even, other figures. When we think of cosmic garden, cosmic mountain, it's not just deity only, it's also kingship, because the king in Israel anyway, especially if you're the descendant of David, you are sort of the inheritor of the status of the new Eden, because you're ruling from and living in Zion, in Jerusalem, which again is described in a variety of ways, and we're going to see some of those ways in this episode, like Eden or like a garden. And that last one is the one we sort of aren't really aware of, because we associate these things only with tabernacle, only with temple, but the temple's in Zion, the temple's in Jerusalem. And, if you do some archaeological research, the temple is very close. Some would say, almost immediately adjacent to the king's palace. And, you have this whole complex of ideas that again, we have to do work to ferret out so that we can see the connection points. And that's what we're going to do in this episode. We're going to be talking about cosmic garden stuff in relation to God and the Israelite king, and ultimately the ultimate Israelite king, the Messiah, who is Jesus. So, some of that stuff, again, we already know if we're unseen realm readers, but we're going to go a little bit deeper here into the weeds and into the details. So let's just sort of talk about paradise, to jump in here. Again, cosmic gardens in this society, especially again before, urbanism, and even with urbanism, I mean, it was a struggle. It's a struggle to have food. It's a struggle to have enough water supply, so on and so forth. Well, this is why these gardens are described the way they are. You'll never want for any food. It's an oasis. There's always going to be enough water. I mean, it is the perfect place to be. And so that whole idea, the paradise idea, actually, gets carried through the Old Testament as well. I mean, why is Canaan, for instance, described as the land flowing with milk and honey? Well, in part, it's to denote this idea of, if we live here, we'll never want for anything. All our needs will be met. It's sort of a utopian description. And in that sense, it goes along with the rest of this Edenic imagery. The paradise idea gets even more important, at least for our topic today, when we start looking at certain passages in the Septuagint. And again, for those to whom that term is unfamiliar, the Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. Most often, the Septuagint uses the word paradisos. Does that sound like paradise? Okay, well, again, that's what it is. Greek paradisos is typically used of the word for garden in the Old Testament. Garden of Eden is the Gan Eden. Okay, Gan is the word for garden. And most of the time, the Septuagint will use paradisos, of garden. And it does so consistently with the Garden of Eden. This is part of why the Garden of Eden, again, develops this sense of being a paradise or a utopia. Again, all our needs are met. But frankly, you don't even need the word to think that. All you need to know is about the cosmic garden, cosmic abode idea from the wider ancient Near East, and you're still going to have a paradise, a well-watered paradise. So you don't need paradisos from Greek. But it's interesting, and again, for our purposes today, there's going to be a place for this in the discussion. So we have a paradise. I think a little bit more about Eden. We have Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are, of course, created as God's imagers. They are the imagers of the king, because God is king. Okay? They were kings by proxy in God's home, which is his garden, which is his temple, which is his palace. And the cosmic garden is all those things. Yeah, it's a garden, but it's also an abode, in this case for God. And where God is, his entourage is. So, the divine council, Adam and Eve, as humans being created to be fit to occupy the same sacred space. And these are all familiar ideas from Unseen Realm, but it's also, again, a temple and palace and so on and so forth. As such, Adam and Eve are the first instance of human kings in the garden. The king in the garden idea is something I want in the back of your mind during this episode. Because believe it or not, in ancient Near Eastern literature, kings were often portrayed as gardeners. Sounds kind of odd. Like, oh, they all had the same hobby. Now, that wasn't the point. The king as the gardener, especially if the king occupied the cosmic garden, or the earthly imitation, the earthly counterpart, the earthly touch point of the cosmic garden, if that's what you're thinking, then the reason that the king is a gardener is the same reason that the king is a shepherd he is a provider for his land. He is the ultimate provider. He is the one who either the gods put in charge in power, or is somehow depicted as, a god himself. He is the one through whom the gods or God maintain the order that they desire, or that in Israel's case, that God desires, that he desires. That's the king. The king is the gardener. The king is the one who maintains the utopia. The meets the needs of his people is probably the best way to put it. And so when things get out of whack, this is what they pay you the big bucks for if you're king. When things get out of whack, naturally you're going to blame the king. And the king, might blame the priesthood if you have it real bad if you're a king and a priest. But you get this idea, the people who are supposed to be connected to the gods, and the gods aren't happy. That's why it hasn't rained. This is how it works. This is how the whole thought system works. So it's not unusual, but again, it's not something we realize. The ancient person would realize this, much more apparently. But it's not unusual for kings to be portrayed as gardeners in the ancient world. Now, we might, probably the closest that we would come to sort of recognize this is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, okay? But this is an image, and this is imagery that is, much wider than that situation in Babylon. It's a very common thing. So back to Adam and Eve. Again, Adam and Eve are the first sort of biblical examples of the king in the garden. There just happens to be two. Humanity is God's king on earth. He's God's proxy. Humans are God's proxy by virtue of being his imagers on the earth. And the dominion mandate is applied to both. So it's appropriate to talk about both Adam and Eve having this status. As the biblical story keeps moving, then eventually it moves toward this notion of a single leader who was a man. That'll come to represent the leadership of God's people, whom he's trying to redeem, and through whom, through which, God is trying to restore Eden. So you get people like Noah and the patriarchs and Moses and Joshua, and of course, all the way up to the kings, the archetype of which is David. So we go from a couple, the human couple, the origin of the human in the biblical story, as being God's proxies. They're both given the same set of mandates. It's not to mean that they don't have different gifts and all this kind of stuff. They're humans, all right? But it's appropriate to talk about them both in this, sharing this same status, because they're male and female. God creates them as his image, and the mandate is given to both of them. And a lot of the debate around like the role of women in ministry and how we should look at women. This is why for a lot of people it turns on the fall. The fall changes the situation. All this kind of stuff. In other words, it's a result of the fall. One particular view. I'm not worried about any of that. Again, we did a whole series on my blog on that. I can have fun arguing either side of that, which is why there's such a debate, because there's a lack of clarity on exactly how. Not how to approach. Really, it's how you approach certain questions in that whole debate. But I'm not concerned about that right now. I want you to think about Adam and Eve collectively. Humanity is the king, the proxy of the king in the garden. So there's an immediate association between kings. We would call them, to be more theologically astute or fancy, I guess, or maybe accurate. We would call them either steward kings or steward rulers. But that's what they are. Again, cosmic garden, these are the ones that God has put in charge of, what's supposed to happen here. Now, we also get parallels, and we've talked a little bit about this on the podcast before, between Adam and Eve, and especially Adam and Israel. Adam and Israel have clear parallels. I spent a little bit of time in Unseen Realm talking about this, the way things that happened to Adam also happened to Israel and vice versa. There are these connection points. I reference, a few times, both in the book and again, we've mentioned this kind of thing briefly on the podcast, but the work of Seth Postel, his book is called Adam and Israel. There's just a lot to this. There's a lot to see here as far as parallels between Adam and Israel. And we know, again, that this more or less continues on. We have, Jesus is the second Adam. Okay, and the point of that is not to exclude Eve. The point is that Jesus is a new humanity. Okay, we're going to come back to that point as well. So again, by virtue of the way incarnation works, and the incarnation has to work a certain way because of the Davidic covenant. The Messiah is going to be a man because it's a male, a king descended from David. And I mean, there are reasons why it works out the way it does, that we don't need to, pick apart in our postmodern and the context in which we live. There are reasons why it is the way it is in the biblical story and the biblical connection points, because of when the biblical writers wrote and what they were trying to communicate. So we have, again, this connectivity, cosmic garden, kingship, rulership, if you will, Adam. We've got, the kings, we've got Jesus. Again, and since we're talking about these connections between Jesus and Adam, or the Davidic king and Adam, or the Messiah and Adam, these sorts of things, because the Messiah is a representative of Israel. He represents Israel corporately. Because we have that situation going on, again, what I'm trying to do is set the table for when we think about gardens, we should be thinking about kings and ultimately Messiah and, of course, Jesus. Because an ancient person, again, would have had these things. Again, this would have been the matrix of ideas floating around in the ancient person's head that helps them look at the data points and start connecting things so that they could read a passage and it would make sense to them on a level that it doesn't make sense to us. So again, bearing all that in mind, I want to go out to a few resources as I've been doing, this in I don't know if we can call this a series or not, but just this Old Testament and New Testament thing. And I'm going to ask a question for today, or, just to sort of kick the can down the road a little bit. If gardens are connected with the presence of God and the King in the Old Testament, and again, that's very obvious, and it's going to become even more obvious as we proceed, it should be expected that there would also be this connection to the Messiah. Now, the first article I'm going to reference is by Joachim Shaper. I think it's a long A pronunciation, or Shaper, but Shaper. The Messiah in the Garden, John 19:38 through 41. Royal Gardens and Messianic Concepts. Now, this is something I can't put in the protected folder because it's in a book. It's not something that you can get a whole PDF, and I don't actually have the book. I got enough of it, in Google Books to make it useful to dip into a little bit. It's going to be one of 3 or 4 sources I mentioned today. So you'll just have to, again, know that the resource is out there, but his article is really interesting. It's in a book called Paradise in Antiquity, Jewish and Christian Views. It's a 2010 title, so it's not rare or unusual. And on page 3, he begins this article again talking about these connection points, and he writes this. He goes, there are plenty of mentions of gardens in the Hebrew Bible, including many which see gardens as being of special importance to kings, just like in numerous texts and images from other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Indeed, kings are often depicted as gardeners because of the special significance gardens have in what one might call the Near Eastern symbolic system. Although, as has rightly been said, evidence of the concept of the king as gardener in the Hebrew Bible is inconclusive, and he gives a few scattered references. It is nevertheless very likely that the image of the king as gardener played a similar role in Israel. This is supported by the fact that a king's garden is mentioned on numerous occasions in the Bible. Okay, we're going to talk about some of those references because some of them are going to be pretty important. But again, that's a fact. You actually get references to the king's garden in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, doesn't seem like anything that we care about remembering. Okay, the king had a garden, big deal. But again, that's because of the way we're thinking when we read the text, and they would have thought a bit differently. Shaper goes on and says the connection between gardens and kings is less obvious in the Hebrew Bible than it is in the Mesopotamian literature, but it is nevertheless present. And he goes on to talk about, it's surprising to him that scholars who talk about the cosmic mountain, the cosmic garden, and New Testament scholars as well, because he's angling toward John. He's very verbal about this in the article. It surprises him that more scholars haven't spent more time on this because it's kind of hard to miss, when you really start drilling down into it. For instance, in the article, he'll point out that the term paradisos, remember I mentioned that earlier, that's the way that the Septuagint typically translates the Garden of Eden, the Gan, again, Hebrew word for garden is Gan, that is typically paradisos in the Septuagint. So it has this denotion of paradise. Well, that actually comes, it's a Median loan word. The Medes and the Persians. Well, the Medes, this term, the Greek term paradisos, has actually been demonstrated to be a Median word originally. Paradiesa. Pari means around, and daesa is an enclosure. So a paradiesa, or a paradisos, going into Greek, is some kind of walled enclosure. Again, that is probably lush. The inside of it, they're growing things, but it's a walled enclosure. It's obvious that the Medes are linked to the Persians in the Old Testament, and in turn, other Second Temple literature, because the Persian period butts up right against the beginning of the Second Temple period. Those things are obvious, but I just want to sort of throw out one thing. If somebody in this audience that's listening to this wants to presume that the biblical paradise motifs and ideas come from Persia, in other words, the Torah is just it was written during the Persian period, or none of it existed prior to the exile, all this kind of stuff. Well, that's extreme, and they'd be mistaken. They'd be quite mistaken. For instance, Shaper's article gets into this a little bit. He just wants to say the same thing, but I'm going to belabor it a little bit. He quotes Jan Bremer's work, for instance, and Bremer is a familiar name, at least to me. He specializes in ancient Near Eastern and Greek connections. He has an essay entitled Paradise from Persia via Greece to the Septuagint. And he also notes the Median origin of the term and the overreach of the data when people try to say that, well, all this biblical stuff is Persian. So he, just a little snippet from a citation of Bremer. He says that, let's see here, the term paradiesa entered Hebrew as pardes and Greek as paradisos. Unfortunately, it's virtually impossible to arrive at certain conclusions regarding the usage and meaning of the term in Median, since, as Bremer points out, being faced with the absence of early Iranian material, in other words, that's literature that's old enough to sort of precede the Septuagint here. We don't have a whole lot of that for Persian. In light of that absence, we will have to take recourse to its use as loanword in more or less contemporary Akkadian and Elamite texts in order to reconstruct its meaning in the oldest period of the Persian multicultural empire. And he writes, this is Shaper now concluding, indeed, neither the Median nor the Persian form of the term is documented in the extant Old Persian material. You don't have a single instance of this term in the Persian literature that actually exists that predates the Septuagint. So again, for those internet theologians who would listen to this and it's all late. None of this stuff existed prior to the Persian era. This is where the Hebrews get all their theology. No. Just try again. So I just wanted to throw that out because I think it's important, at least for this audience. Now, in some regards, some of this is going to be familiar for another reason, and that is we've had Rusty Osborne on the podcast before, and he spoke at our Naked Bible Conference. Rusty is the guy who did all the work on ancient Near Eastern kings and trees. Well, trees are parts of gardens. So we actually, back in episode 222, we touched on a little bit of this, or Rusty did, as we interviewed him about this topic. So again, I'm just hoping that some of this is stimulating some memory, and also for those who didn't listen to that earlier material or don't have Unseen Realm, what we're trying to do here is set up a simple thought. Okay, the gods, or God dwells in a garden. God is king. The king, the kings, the leaders who follow, and the institutions of divine presence are going to be caricatured, not caricature, that's the wrong word, but characterized in garden terms. Again, because this is paradise, this is utopia, this is Eden. Okay, and it's very natural for things that come later in the Old Testament that are going to take our minds back to Eden because they are part of the restoration path toward the ultimate Eden in the future. This would be again just the most normal thing to do if you want to keep this in people's heads, keep this in the mind. The temple, we have a temple here because this is God's presence, and ultimately this is headed somewhere. Messiah is going to come, and all these different thoughts that are going to culminate in a garden, okay, with a king. God is king, and again for New Testament Christians, that's going to be the returning Christ. So this is again, the framework that we're creating here. And we're going to take it back to John 20 when, Jesus, right after the resurrection. Now, I want to get into a few specific references here, because paradisos is not the only Greek term that is used to translate gan, the Hebrew word for garden. There's another one. And scholars like to, kind of argue about, is this significant? But the other one is kapos. Kapos. And this, it turns out, is the word that's actually used in John. John doesn't use paradisos. He uses this word. So a little snippet here from Shaper. The Septuagint at times translates gan with kapos, and it also does so when royal or other leading characters are involved in one way or another. And he cites a couple passages. He cites 2 Kings 21:18. Let's go to 2 Kings 21:18 and take a look at that. Again, this is stuff, it's just so easy to read over. This is Manasseh has died. Again, Manasseh was a horrible king. But we read this in verse 18, 2 Kings 21. Manasseh slept with his fathers and was buried in the garden of his house, in the garden of Uzzah, and Ammon, his son, reigned in his place. And a few verses later, when it comes time for Ammon to kick the bucket, we have verse 25, same chapter. Now the rest of the acts of Ammon that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Verse 26, and he was buried in his tomb in the garden of Uzzah, basically the same place as his father, and Josiah his son reigned in his place. So it's kind of odd, we've got this, the king's palace would naturally be in Jerusalem, and there's a garden there, and that's where they're buried, at least these kings anyway. A couple other references to this sort of thing. Again, the king's garden that are just interesting. You have Jeremiah 52:7. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled and went out from the city by night by the way of a gate between the two walls by the king's garden. Okay, this is just a reference to the Babylonian invasion. Esther 7:7. Now this one's going to be outside of Jerusalem, obviously. So it's not an Israelite context, but the same thing is going on here. This is Haman. Haman's going to get hanged. The king arose in his wrath, from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. Okay, so again, the king, Ahasuerus, to whom Esther is married, and they set up Haman. Again, the story of Esther. That king has a palace garden. So again, it's kind of normal. And the next one is really interesting. We're going to come back to this a couple of times, but Nehemiah 3:16. Nehemiah 3:16. And for those who, I'm going to mention the Septuagint here again, because all of these in the Septuagint that I'm reading are kapos. They're not paradisos, they're kapos. And this one, again, turns out to have some real interest here. Nehemiah 3:16. If you have a Septuagint, an English translation of it, there is no Nehemiah 3:16 in the Septuagint. The reference is 2 Esdras 13:16. That's the name for Nehemiah in the Septuagint, and the numbering system is just quite different. But that's what it is, and it's kapos. But let me just read the verse, and I'll read it from the Lexham English Septuagint here. It's going to be, it's actually verse 16. So 2 Esdras 13:16, or if you're in Logos, you can just link these two together, Nehemiah 3:16. Behind him, Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, ruler around the area of Beth Zor, took possession as far as the garden, now catch this, the garden of the tomb of David. Isn't that interesting? David, again, to whom is given the Jerusalemite dynasty, where he's buried, there was a garden. Lo and behold, who would have expected that? And again, since our subject today is Jesus being quote unquote mistaken for the gardener. Yeah, Mary made that mistake, but the question is, did John? Or is John deliberately including this episode with its details? Not so that readers like us would wonder, well, we got to figure out how Mary didn't know him. We got to do apologetics now. Or is he doing it to make his readers think, oh, okay, Jesus son of David, Messiah, buried, where he is, the whole story. And then he's the gardener, of course. Again, this is where what we're angling for here, but we're still in the Old Testament. I'm just telegraphing that again, the Nehemiah reference is really interesting, and it's kapos. It's the same word used in John. The garden there at the tomb of David. So the question obviously is, where we're at in the episode, is there significance to the use of both terms? So we've got paradisos used, most of the time for garden, but then you also get kapos. Is there any significance to the two terms? I mean, is there some crucial difference between them, or is it a distinction without a difference? Just a couple of thought trajectories. Now, again, to telegraph this a little bit, I don't think I think it's sort of a distinction without a difference, but you'll figure out why as we go through here. A couple of thoughts here. Both terms are used of the residence of kings, both of them. You'll see paradisos and you'll see kapos used of the residence of kings. One is frequently more abstractly the cosmic mountain idea. That's paradisos. At least it's more explicit. But as we're going to see, and we sort of already had, because here we have a kapos, with the tomb of David. David's in Jerusalem, Zion. Okay, so really the terms overlap. But again, just to proceed through some of the data, because the data is interesting. Both of the terms do get used of the residence of kings, and sometimes, again, the lines blur. A footnote here, prior to the time of Hezekiah, little sidebar here, David and other Davidic kings of Judah were buried in the city of David. Okay, that would make sense, again, with the Davidic monarchy thing going on. There are a couple of exceptions, and I'm going to reference an article here, and I believe I did put this in the protected folder. S. Yavin, that's Yeivin. This is an older article. It's called The Sepulchres of the Kings of the House of David. This is the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, Volume 7, Number 1. It's 1948, and it's about 15 pages, 30 to 45. So what Yavin does is he goes through all the places where the kings are buried. Before, really it's all of them post David. He mentions a little bit what's going on before David, but once David, conquers Jerusalem, we've got the Davidic dynasty going on there. All he and the kings that follow him are typically, if they're from his line, they're going to be buried, in the city of David, which again would make sense. Now, he even goes through the exceptions. I'm not going to worry about the exceptions now because for our purpose, they're not important. But there were some episodic things that, a couple of kings wind up not being buried there, and it isn't because they were wicked. They're just some more odd circumstances. But if you were a Davidite, you're going to get buried in the city of David. You may not be, if you were a bad guy, you may not be buried with, in one particular sepulcher. You might be buried somewhere else. Like Manasseh's buried in the garden of his palace. Okay, but it's still in the city of David. That sort of thing. So Yavin's article does a nice job of going through all of that material. I'm going to quote from it in a little bit. Okay, second point, there are connections, and again, this is a little bit repetitive from what we had said a little bit earlier about how the terms paradisos and kapos, these two Greek terms that show up in the Septuagint, both translations of Hebrew garden. So this is a little bit repetitious, but there are connections, again, between those terms, not just because they sort of overlap in a few places, but also because of the way, in particular, you've got one of these things sort of qualified. For instance, in Ezekiel 36:35, we read this. This is the Septuagint. I'm reading from the Lexham English Septuagint. They will say, the land became destroyed like a garden of delight, and the deserted and blotted out and utterly destroyed cities sat secure. Now, that's a bit of an odd translation, but if we go over to, again, the English Bible, again, something rendering the Hebrew text, you'll see, get the point. They will say, this land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden. Okay, so in Lexham English Septuagint, again, because of the Greek verb there, has the land became destroyed. like a garden of delight. That doesn't make much sense. But again, it's awkward there. But what the real idea here is, again, this is Ezekiel talking about the demise of Jerusalem. We did a whole series on Ezekiel, and this is the chapter that Jerusalem gets destroyed in the temple. I mean, a lot hinges on this particular chapter. And the whole point is that, look, this place, Jerusalem, was supposed to be like Eden, and then we had the exile, and it got destroyed. But on the other side of that, again, Ezekiel 36 is going to go into Ezekiel 37 and talk about the resurrection of the nation and so on and so forth. Basically, Ezekiel doesn't want to leave them hopeless. And he says, look, there's going to come a day, if we go back to verse 33, on that day I will cleanse you from all your iniquities, says the Lord God, that eventually I'm going to forgive you. You're going to come back here, and the reverse is going to happen. The land that is destroyed currently is going to become, again, like the Garden of Eden. And everything that's waste and desolate, the ruined cities are going to become fortified and inhabited. There's going to be this total reversal. Now, why did I bring this up? Because in the Septuagint, even though it's kind of clunky, the word for garden here is kapos, the one that's not paradise. But the garden here, the kapos, in the Septuagint is followed by another word. If you remember in the Septuagint translation, it was the garden of delight. Okay, there's a Greek word there, truphe. That's the word for delight. And that word is used in the Septuagint in Genesis 2 and 3 to describe Eden. So here I have an instance where kapos, the Greek word that's quote unquote not paradise, is described in the same way that Eden is. It is paradise. The point I'm trying to make here is that these terms, yes, they're different. But again, I think it's a distinction without a difference. I don't think that you can. And some scholars, there are very few scholars, as Schraper, had pointed out, that even think about John 20, the garden, with the king as gardener in the ancient Near East. Very, very few scholars have even sort of, stumbled across that and tried to run it down. And among the few that have, there will be some that say, well, John isn't doing anything here with Genesis or anything like that. He's not using anything in the Old Testament because he doesn't use the word paradisos, and that's the Genesis word. That's the Garden of Eden word. Well, big deal. He uses kapos, and kapos is described the way Eden was anyway. So this is why I think this is a distinction without a difference. So I wanted to get that out of the way because, some of you, if you sort of follow up this episode and you do your own study, you're going to run into that. There's more to it, though. There's even more to it. Remember the references I read to you in 2 Kings? Manasseh and Ammon are buried in the Garden of Uzzah. All right. Well, Yavin has a discussion. Again, this is the article on the sepulchres of the kings, the house of David in Jerusalem. In his article, he discusses this phrase. And there's basically a debate here. Uzzah. A lot of scholars think that's a variant spelling of King Uzziah. And I'll telegraph right away that's where I'm at. And then others will say, no, it's Uzzah, the guy who got killed because he touched the ark. Like he had a garden somewhere, all right? He's buried somewhere. Okay. Well, Yavin comments on this, and he says, can this garden of Uzzah, where the last kings of Judah were buried, be identified with any plausibility? It has already been noted that Uzziah, the king, was buried in the field of the burial which belonged to the kings. It is just possible that this field had been called ever since Uzziah, the field of Uzziah, or Uzzah, again, variant spelling, or the garden of Uzzah. David resided in the citadel, in which he felt safe even in the event of war or siege. Again, the citadel in this place is his point. Solomon, too, had his residence there, again, in this field or in this garden. At first, this is where Solomon lived early on. However, since he did not wage any wars and peace prevailed during his reign, he built himself a palace in what, in his time, was the northern part of Jerusalem. During the reigns of Solomon's successors, however, Jerusalem was almost constantly waging war and in danger of possible sieges. It therefore seems reasonable to expect those kings to have had a preference for the old residence within the precincts of the fortified citadel where this garden was, okay? And they may even have erected a new palace there. Such a palace could have been built either by Azariah, who's also known as Uzziah, or Hezekiah, for both had carried out large building programs in the realm generally and in Jerusalem in particular. Whether a new palace was or was not erected within the citadel, It seems probable that the later kings sought to increase the amenities of their residence and to find room for a garden adjoining their place of abode. Open ground within the citadel could not have been too extensive. What would have been more natural, he asks, than to convert the field of burial belonging to the kings, which must have been in the vicinity of the palace, into a garden adjoining the residence? Okay, water for such a garden could have been obtained through the old Jebusite Sinor. Now it will not be difficult to identify the garden of Uzziah, of the royal residence, with the field of the burial belonging to the kings, where King Uzziah was buried. So, again, there's a way, this is why I read this, there's a way to connect this garden of Uzzah with a royal residence. Okay, and it's not just idiosyncratic to Manasseh or Ammon, his son, but it's also this place, this garden, is associated with other kings, David and Solomon. Okay, they're not buried there, but they lived there, at least in part, during different times of their reigns. There was a residence there. So, again, there are these connection points. The terms overlap. Now, for our purposes, again, to summarize the point, there are connections between David, post-Davidic burials, an enclosed garden, the royal residence, and paradise language in both terms, paradisos and kapos. These things overlap. They're points of connection in the Old Testament. In passages that are pretty obscure, like who cares about the king's gardens and what his house looked like and all that kind of stuff. But for the sake of this purpose, if you're an Israelite and you know where the king lives and you know these things, there's going to be, if you've at least been taught, anything by your rabbi or your teacher or wherever you're getting your religious knowledge from, the priesthood somewhere, there's going to be these associations that, again, form a matrix of ideas in your head about the king's house and the garden and who he is and why he's here and all these sorts of things, especially if it's David, because, again, the promise given to David about the legitimacy of the throne in Jerusalem and then ultimately a Messiah figure. So why this is important is because John 20:15 uses kapos, as does John 19:41. Okay, let's just back up a little bit. Okay, John 20:15 is mistaking him to be the gardener. This is the scene. They're in the kapos, okay? But there's an earlier verse, John 19:41. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a kapos. There was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb. Okay, in the kapos, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. And this is where Jesus gets buried. And again, where he rises, he's in the kapos. Okay, and if you go back to the Septuagint, again, this is by virtue of Nehemiah, and the Nehemiah 3:16, or if you're reading the Septuagint, it's Second Esdras. Okay, but by virtue of Nehemiah, I'm going to read it to you again. This is from the Septuagint. Behind him, Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, a ruler around the area of Bethzor, took possession as far as the garden, the kapos, of the tomb of David. Okay, at this point, you should be thinking, okay, garden, tomb. David had a garden tomb. How about that? Jesus had a garden tomb as well. Again, there's actually a direct connection between John 19 and John 20, and this obscure reference to this particular garden, associated with the tomb of David. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit here and say a few things about specifically, drill down into the New Testament side of this. So Shaper writes this. He's getting into the New Testament part of his article, and he's quoting C.K. Barrett, who is a famous New Testament commentator. As Barrett rightly points out, John 19:41 is preparing for John 20:15, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene as the gardener. He says, we're going to return to this in a moment, but the interesting point is that Barrett, Bultmann, Schnackenberg, and all the other great commentators in the Gospel of John, certainly all those I've been able to consult, fail to see the royal and messianic connotations of these verses. He says the only commentator that comes close to realizing it, but then he takes a wrong term, is Raymond Brown. This is Father Brown, his massive John commentary in the Anchor Bible series. It's 2 volumes. who he discusses it when he's talking about some of the views of the church fathers and Aquinas. So again, Schaper is lamenting the fact that, I mean, here this is like just laying the table for a direct association with David. And you'll scarcely ever find it in a commentary. Continuing, he writes this: "It is indeed a remarkable fact that the ancient world is full of examples of royal burials in palace gardens. This is a general observation, but there are also the special significance of the garden mentioned in 2 Kings 21, 18, and 26, which we read, connected with Manasseh and Ammon, and the mention of the king's garden in various verses. Nehemiah 3:16, of course, through the Septuagint, links the king's garden with the tomb of David. Acts 2:29 actually refers to that tomb, as does Josephus in his Jewish War 1.61. As Stordalen, he's quoting another source now, who has he's done a lot of work on Edenic imagery in the Old Testament. As Stordalen rightly points out, quote, "Assuming that the short notes, again, in the passage just quoted, contain historically reliable information, one would concede that the king's garden was located in the Kidron Valley, outside into the southeast of the Jebusite citadel. Judging from archaeological remains, such a garden would have been watered through channels and aqueducts from the Gihon source, possibly also from En Rogel near the floor of the valley." Again, this is more connection. It's another scholar that connects this with David and his time at the citadel. All of this, again, blends together to create an identification between Jesus and David. One more article here, just to reference this, and this is also in the protected folder, James Cregan. It's called Jesus the Gardener, a revised perspective of a favorite New Testament scene. And this is in a collection of conference papers from the University of Notre Dame in Australia in 2012. He writes this, and he interacts with Schaper, which is why I wanted to include this. He says, according to Schaper, it is the point that John is making, is that the point that John is making, both implicitly and explicitly, through a combination of references, goes in a specific direction to David. These references would have been accepted and understood by his Gospel of John's author, John, by his audience. They would have understood these things, both historically and also religiously, through their connection to the Hebrew Scriptures, where, for example, the king's garden features as the resting place of both Manasseh and Ammon. Extending this point, the Septuagint translation of Nehemiah 3:16 in particular connects the king's garden in the Kidron Valley, next to the site of the ancient temple, with the tomb of David, as does Acts 2:29, which simultaneously draws a connection between the presence of David's tomb among the faithful and the resurrection of Christ. John, describing the burial of Jesus, implicitly references this through placing Jesus' body in a new tomb within a garden that was also the place of Jesus' crucifixion. We should also note that the Gihon, one of the four rivers of creation, it's the Gihon, one of the four rivers of Eden, the four rivers of creation issuing from Eden, which fed the gardens of the Kidron Valley through the king's garden, was also the site of royal coronations. What about that? Thus Solomon is anointed and proclaimed king at the Gihon in 1 Kings 1, 33 through 34, 44 through 45. Similarly, Psalm 110, depending on your translation, describes the Messiah, king and priest, drinking from the Gihon, either as part of a victory procession or a ritualistic aspect of a coronation rite. Now, there's a lot in that quote. But not only do we have a direct association by virtue of the garden and Jesus being the gardener with David, just in terms of a garden tomb, but now we get coronation. And isn't the resurrection, again, we talked about this on either an episode or a couple episodes ago, the crucifixion and the resurrection as the coronation of Jesus. It's what validates him as king. Again, all of this is just floating right beneath the surface. You're looking at the garden tomb where Jesus, is crucified and is buried and rises again, where Mary encounters him and doesn't recognize him right away. But again, that isn't John's point. John's point is, do you see where Jesus was crucified? You see where he was buried as a garden tomb? Does that ring any bells for you folks? And this garden tomb is watered by the Gihon. You know what happened at the Gihon? Yeah, that's right. That's where kings were crowned. This is what he's angling for. It's really kind of crazy when you think about it. Again, all these little threads that sort of converge, in these sorts of situations. So, again, there it is. The point of the scene in John 20:15. I'm going to go back to Shaper now and read his conclusion. Taking all the above into account, all this stuff, and realizing that the location of the historical King's Valley, or King's Garden, is likely to have been in the Kidron Valley, it becomes extremely likely that the mention of the garden, and indeed of a garden in the Kidron Valley in John 18, we haven't even brought up that verse yet, John 18:1. John references, John's tracking 18:1, 19:41, 20:15, and 16. He leads you by the nose to this conclusion, to this scene. He's setting you up as a writer. Okay, back to the quote here. It's extremely likely that the mention of the garden, and indeed of a garden in the Kidron Valley in the Gospel of John, was intended to make an extremely important symbolic point. The tomb of Jesus, like that of David and other Davidic rulers, is located in a garden, most likely in the traditional king's garden mentioned in the scriptures. And also, the amount of spices Nicodemus is said to have provided for the grave is appropriate for a royal burial. The implicit statement is that Jesus is the legitimate heir of David and the Messiah of Israel. And this is reinforced by the fact that the risen Christ appears to Mary Magdalene as I've waited until this quote just to give you this, but the word for garden is kapos. What's the word for gardener? The kapuros. Again, it even the choice of that term takes you back into these other things. Christ appears to Mary Magdalene as the kapuros, the gardener. This too carries royal overtones, since kings in the ancient Near East were often depicted as gardeners. I would love to go down in the king as gardener point, but I know there are those in the audience who you just can't wait to find these sorts of sources, and most of these I believe are online. Nicholas Wyatt, A Royal Garden, The Ideology of Eden, the Scandinavian Journal of the Old Testament. He's going to have material in that article about kings in the ancient Near East portrayed as gardeners. There's a Trinity Western dissertation by Yehun Brian Kim called Yahweh as Gardener in the Old Testament, with special reference to Psalm 104. That is in the protected folder. There's another article, Duke June Park, Yahweh is a Gardener and Zion is his garden, a study of the garden metaphor in the book of Isaiah. That's a Westminster Seminary dissertation, also in the protected folder. Donald Patrick, who's a horticulturalist, Imperial Gardens of Mesopotamia, Landscapes of Power, has a lot of, he has material in there about how kings in the ancient Near East are portrayed as gardeners. It's an obscure subject, but there's actually a lot of material there. Again, that's the last one there is academia.edu. There's a lot of this material out there, but again, I think for our purposes, the real conclusion is the point that we might as well throw Cregan in here. I've given you the other two conclusions. Here's Cregan in his article, his conclusion. The mention of the garden in John 19 and 20 was intended to make an extremely important symbolic point. This is to argue that in locating Jesus' tomb in a garden like that of David and other Davidic rulers, Jesus is depicted by John as, quote, a true Davidite and king Messiah, buried in the king's garden and demonstrating his messiahship by rising from the grave in the very same garden in which, according to tradition, David's tomb was located. I'm the Davidic heir. I am the Messiah. I am the king, and my kingdom will have no end. I just rose from the dead. Are there any questions? The theological telegraphing that's going on here in a simple phrase in John 20, again, is why I wanted to do this topic. I mean, there are things like this, and I know you probably get tired of me saying it, but there are just things like this in the pages of your Bible just lurking there, waiting to be discovered. Because when you go to John 20, I'm like anybody else. I went a lot of years, without ever reconsidering John 20, because I was prone to read it the same way. Well, Mary should know that. What's going on here? And I gotta go, pull off, dust off my, encyclopedia Bible difficulties, and try to figure this out for an apologetic purpose. Okay, that isn't even remotely in John's mind. And John is doing what he's doing and using this episode, with Mary. Again, of all the things he could have used, he uses this episode, in the garden with Mary, not to make his reader. This isn't Final Jeopardy, okay, for the people reading his gospel. That isn't what John's doing. Here's a great Final Jeopardy question. How did Mary not know? That's just not even on the table. What he wants people to see is the location, and again, how she just mistook him for the gardener. He wants that term. He wants that word in there because of what it's going to do to the reader's head in connecting these theological dots. So again, it's kind of an obscure topic, but there you go. Maybe is it less? We have a poll, Trey. As we wrap up here, is this one less obscure or more obscure than the honeycomb? I mean, which is it? But we've been dealing with some obscure things here, but there's a lot packed into this subject as there was in that one.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's more obscure, but how many more are out there? I mean, it's like I feel like now it's just the Bible's riddled with this. There are a lot of things hidden in plain sight. And to us it is, and I like these things because it illustrates how well, sure, Mike, if I'd have lived back then, I would be seeing this stuff too. Yeah, that's kind of the point. Yeah.
That's what we do here, to try to convince you to, do the work to try to, get them in your head so that you do notice these things. And if you notice enough of them, I'm glad. I want you to be suspicious. I want you to suspect that there's something going on in just about every paragraph. That's a good thing. It puts you into thinking mode, which is always a good thing with Scripture.